Hi, Elspeth. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Hi, Elspeth.
Hi.
So, so it's really nice to speak with you. I really enjoyed reading your book, "Feed Us with Trees: Nuts and the Future of Food." I have it right here. I've been reading it a lot for the last month, and I've been really interested in tree nuts over the past few years, just in my own work, but also my personal life. So your book just kind of came along right at the perfect time, for my own interest, and I'm learning a lot. Can you tell me how and why you first started thinking about tree nuts?
I'm a journalist on Cape Cod, and I've been reporting on food and the environment for our local NPR station for about 15 years. And in 2019, a friend sent me a TEDx talk by a woman named Marcy Mayer, who's in Greece, and she calls herself an acorn ambassador and said that acorns are edible, which I did not know, and that they're one of our oldest human foods and a staple food in a lot of places over the past 12,000 years. And I didn't know any of this, and I live in this giant oak forest that's all protected as part of the Cape Cod National Seashore. And so suddenly the woods around me, which I'd always seen as a bit of an impediment to food production, I started looking at in a new way, and I went pretty far down the tree nut rabbit hole pretty quickly.
Yeah. Um, so what did you do? Did you just start gathering acorns, and then did you know what to do with them once you found them?
No, I did not know what to do. I did start picking up acorns. I started reading a lot too about different cultures that
Mhm.
either still eat acorns or had in the past. And from there started branching out, realizing there were other nuts too that had been staple crops, really like everyday foods like corn or wheat or rice. And that was pretty surprising to me. And at first I thought, oh, this must have been something they did in like hilly areas where row crop agriculture wasn't such an option. But the more I
Mhm.
learned, the more I realized, no, this was widespread in most cultures across the Northern Hemisphere until pretty recently. Uh, and as my mom always likes to say, I never stop asking why. I've been doing that since I was about 3. So then I was like, well, why? Like, why would we stop eating this food that is super abundant? Um, so yeah, I kind of just kept following that.
So how important were tree nuts in North America prior to 1492?
Well, it depends on where you are, because there are
Mhm.
so many different native communities all over present day United States. But it ranges from, in some areas, as much made up as much as 50% of some people's diets. This sort of like acorn soup, has been a traditional dish on the West Coast in the present day California area for a long time for a lot of people. And then in other areas, there have been different uses. Like you can make acorns into flour, you can make them into starch, you can make them into oil, which I was really surprised by, an oil that's like really
Mhm.
similar chemically to olive oil. And this man in the 1950s, I want to say his name was Harold Driver, made this pretty cool map of North America with like all the different ways that acorns were used in different places. And so some places they were like processed with lye, similar to corn nixtamalization,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
used that way. Yeah. And then other places, flour. So like it depends on where you are, but anywhere from like kind of a minor food to almost half of someone's diet. So a big range.
Yeah, yeah. That's crazy. It's like I kind of started going down this tree nut wormhole myself because I have chestnut trees in my yard. Like I
Mm.
moved to this house a few years ago, and suddenly I have chestnuts, a ton of them every year. Like from 3 trees, and it's in a ton of food from these three trees, and it's like I collect them, and it's like I can't even eat them all. Like I give them away, or last year I sold some just because I had so many. And and the more like, and I start digging into like, what do I do with chestnuts, and aside of that, and like, why aren't people eating chestnuts? This tree crop that's just kind of everywhere where I live. And then I learned about the blight, of the 1900s, late 1900s, that kind of wiped out the American chestnut trees. But I started reading before that, and just understanding how important at least chestnuts were on the kind of East Coast to our food system. And it's just crazy how much they supplemented our diet. And I know acorns kind of did the same in other parts of the country as well.
Yeah, I spent some time in Appalachia when I was researching the book, because I feel like, especially in the East here, that chestnut culture and the chestnut economy that really existed in a lot of areas, especially in the mountains,
Hmm.
was really present until quite recently. So it seemed like the closest historical connection, at least in the East, to this
Hmm.
abundance that we had once been tapped into. And
Yeah.
it was it was pretty interesting being down there. I went around with the historian Ralph Lutz, and he took me to some general stores where they had these old ledgers that documented the chestnut trade. And in some of these places, collecting chestnuts, so going out into the woods, picking up chestnuts and bringing them into these little general stores, which were kind of like scattered at the same distance as post offices. So, like, every little community had these
Okay.
stores. And in some areas, when he looked at the records, it was making up as much as a third to half of people's income, at least for the store. So, like, in terms of when they would go in and purchase, everything was done on credit, right? So there'd be this ledger showing what they had bought, and then on the other side, things they had brought in. And they brought in eggs and butter and whatever else was extra.
Hmm.
But it was like until September, when the nuts started falling, they were nowhere near close to making up their debt. And then all of a sudden, it was like the chestnuts and the chinkapins, which are a smaller cousin of the American chestnut,
Hmm.
they would start coming, and they would pay off like half of their annual debt in a few weeks from bringing in these nuts.
Hmm.
And in that area where I was, which was like sort of southwestern Virginia, the chestnut blight that killed the trees, and the Great Depression happened at the same time. And one of the women I talked to said that, like, here for them, the Great Depression had nothing to do with stocks and all, no one there was really involved in the stock
Hmm.
market. It was about the trees and the death of those trees and this just total collapse of a way of life.
Yeah. 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 No, it's really crazy to think about how much we relied on these forests, just trees and nuts for so long, and then it's just totally been displaced in decades. And just that connection has been broken, and I don't really know what it's been replaced by. Just like total shit, just like cheap beef and whatever else. And it's really sad.
Yeah, it is really sad. And, it's a lot of it is pretty systemic. When I started looking at the history, it was pretty intentional in some places. The chestnut blight was sort of an outlier in a lot of ways, because when the US government first started sending, basically settler soldiers westward across the
Hmm.
continent, one of the first things that they did in almost every place they went was start destroying indigenous food systems, pretty systemically and very intentionally, to try to control
Hmm.
people and to try to gain control of the land. And there the history was really confusing when I started reading it, because these early Euro-American arrivals would get there and comment on the incredible abundance of these food systems, like salmon so thick,
Yeah.
you can walk across them, trees raining these nuts, geese, like, you couldn't even see the sky. And then within like a decade, as soon as that land was desired by Euro American colonizers, it was like, oh, these people don't know anything about growing food. They're idiots when it comes to food production. It's like, whoa, 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 wait, what's going on here? And so there was this attempt to really paint these trees as an insignificant food source, as a way of uh, controlling the land and taking the land. And I think that's something that we don't talk about a lot in public school history,
Mhm.
but that feed fight, which is a term one historian I read called it, was very systematic and involved, the American government. If even if you were a Euro-American settler, you had to farm the land with row crops for 5 years to get title to the land. So
Mhm.
there was this very systemic push for a very specific type of food production. And now we're seeing the legacy of that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, like growing up, like the you read all these books, just in grade school about, the brave settlers and colonists that, like all the hardships they face going across the land and, and trying to start a farm and, doing all these things. And like all the answers were right in their face and they were just kind of like destroying everything right in front of us, and we're still getting this literature, this little house on the prairie crap that that is just like it's so bizarre that and I don't know about the school system now if we have much hope, what's going on with the Department of Education in this moment, but it's like Jesus Christ, like can't we teach our kids something, something useful?
Yeah, I think, when I started digging through all of this, I was in this moment in my life where I had this like sort of realization about the power of story, which is ironic because I've been a journalist for a while and you would think I already believed in the
Hmm.
power of story. But I had this thing that
Hmm.
happened with my back where I was in a lot of back pain. My mom had always had a bad back. And I just assumed, or I believed that like I just had a bad back too. And that was something that had been handed down to me and it was genetic and there wasn't much I could do about it. And I was going to get surgery. And the surgery place sent me to this very specific PT place. And they said, like, you have to try this PT before you do anything else. And I said, okay, fine. I'd done PT before, but I was like, it's not going to work. And this guy was
Hmm.
like, he sat me down and he was like, there's nothing wrong with your back. The only thing that's wrong with your back is that you think there's something wrong with your back. And he convinced me. He told me a new story. And within a couple weeks, I was doing all this stuff that I'd always been afraid to do. My back did not hurt anymore. And it was right around the same time as I was learning some of this tree nut stuff. And I got really interested in the way that the stories that we've absorbed as kids are sort of controlling our ideas about what's possible and sort of
Hmm.
informing um, our understanding of the world around us in these almost invisible ways. Uh, you know, my whole life there'd been this food raining down on my house that like I hadn't seen, and so I started wondering like, what else am I missing? Like, what else am I not understanding about the stories around food that I grew up with? Uh, and so I started finding all these, I started kind of looking back at the books that I'd loved as a kid and finding all these inconsistencies. You're talking about the settlers moving west, and I had an American Girl doll, which I don't know, other girls my age, I'm sure there's some of you out there listening. I was just obsessed with this doll, Kirsten Larson, and she was a Swedish immigrant who came to the U.S. I mean, she's totally fictional. Came to the U.S. in the
Okay.
1850s, but the whole story, in one part, is about her friendship with this indigenous girl from a imaginary unnamed tribe named Singing Bird, and Singing Bird leaves partway through the book, and it basically says like her people are going west because there's not good hunting anymore, not enough food, too many people on the land. And I started examining some of those stories, and it was like every story I grew up with had some version of that, of like hunting and
Hmm.
gathering is only possible for small groups of people on large tracts of land, And when things get more populated, we have to become farmers and we have to do these sort of monoculture row crops because that's how you produce more
Mm-hmm.
food. And that is not true. Like that's not true at all. That is a
Mm-hmm.
story, and I ended up really picking that one apart in the book. But it started to make me question everything because I was like, wow, all these things are just stories. They're assumptions that I grew up with and have never really questioned because I thought they were facts. Uh, so yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's been an interesting process of unlearning and relearning.
Elspeth, part of the work you have done is, and the thinking, it goes beyond the agricultural side, which is a great part of it, but it has to do with, it has so many layers, right? Like the spiritual, the psychological, the environmental, the philosophical, and it's so connected with history, your background, your legacy, your ancestors, people ancestors. How,
Yeah.
for people that is not familiar with this, how can you layer that for us? So how do you express all this complex system in your educational work, in the book, so that maybe people can be practical about it, but they understand it goes beyond just planting or replanting, right? Because if you don't understand that cosmos, then the whole thing, in a way, is missing the point, right?
Yeah, very much so. When I was writing the book and sort of learning about people who are planting these trees now, I noticed that there were different approaches. Some people were basically trying to recreate the row crop system that we have just with these tree species, spraying for pesticides, doing a monoculture of chestnuts or whatever it is. And then other people had these real polycultures going, these really layered systems where they were thinking a little more holistically, a little more big picture. Um, and so as I kind of followed this history, I just kept wondering, you know, how did we get to where we are? Because I feel like if we don't understand that, we're just going to do the same thing we've done with the rest of industrial farming with these tree species. And that doesn't really represent true change to me. I mean, it's a bit of an improvement, I guess, on like a carbon soil level, but on a systemic biodiversity, cultural, colonial healing level, like it's not really doing that much. Um, and so I just kept going back. I kept going further back in the history until I could really figure out the source of the rupture. And to me, I have a lot of English, German, and French ancestry, but mostly English. And I learned this history that I didn't know about the enclosures movement in England, which was sort of this internal colonization of the country that happened before people like my ancestors migrated to North America. And I feel like that is really this missing piece of the conversation. Along the way with some of this
Yeah.
work, I got to know an Indigenous medicine man and cultural biologist named Ron Reed, who's Karuk. He's in present day California in the northern part. And his people have relied on acorns since time immemorial. And they have a really sort of complex series of ecological and spiritual beliefs that all come together around tending these oak ecosystems. And they call themselves Fix the World people. And every time after I talked to Ron, I would just be like, I don't understand. Why are they Fix the World people and my people are just these destroyers, like destroying everything in our path ecologically? Like, how do we get to this point? And when I started learning about basically this internal colonization of England and the British Isles that happened before that colonization moved outwards and started perpetuating that trauma in other places, um, I was always told that my ancestors came here because it was a land of opportunity, right? That was the story that
Mm-hmm.
I learned as a kid. And really, most people who came here, about 25% of people came here because they wanted to, and 75% from that early English migration came because they were forced off their own land and separated from their own woodland ecosystems during this enclosure process. And so there's this whole history that we don't talk about. And I think if we don't talk about it, we can't heal it. We can't, we can't start mending those relationships, both with the other people who were already here before us, with indigenous people here and with African American people whose lineage involves people who were enslaved. And I just think that it sounds like, there's a lot to throw into a book about tree nuts. But as I kept going, it was like, I really can't tell this story without grappling with these questions because they're
Yeah.
really connected. Um, because it's about a relationship with a place, right? And if you don't understand how you got to that place and what human relationships led you to that, you're not going to be able to deal with the ecological relationships that you're trying to repair.
And connected with that, that's great. Thank you. Connected with that, how would you define a local food system for people that are not
Mm.
necessarily familiar with that idea, that approach?
Yeah, I mean, people have different definitions. Some people limit it to 10 miles or 100 miles or a watershed. Um, I think that one thing that has really stuck out for me in terms of defining a local food system, the more I've been thinking about these tree nuts, is this theme of keystone species. So, as I started learning about oak trees and their history as a food source, um, they're they're also a keystone species. So they're a species that's incredibly important ecologically, and so are a lot of these other nut trees. Um, and so they take care of their ecosystems in a way that not every species can. They host a lot of insect life. That insect life in turn works its way up the food web. So they're as important to their ecosystems as a keystone in the Roman arch. That's why they're called that. Um, and the more I've thought about, like, well, what can we do to localize food production and what does a local food system really look like? I think any successful local food system on the ecological level has to be centered in some way on these keystone species. And that might mean, animals are eating the food from these keystone species. It doesn't necessarily have to mean
Mhm.
it's like your top human food. But
Mhm.
through the process of this book, I've been talking to people all over, and I've been getting that question a lot about how do we relocalize food. And I think it starts with getting into relationship with these keystone species, whatever they are in your area. It might not be an oak tree if you're in the southern hemisphere or somewhere else, um, but their oaks are like the top life support genus in I think 84% of North American counties. So in a lot of places around here, it's a good place to start. And if you start with that big relationship, it kind of then you learn what other species are in relationship with oaks and other keystones, and you can kind of build on that if that makes sense.
Hmm. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it does. If you understand that, then you can follow the logic and work around that in a way that
Yeah, I think
benefits the whole system.
I used to
But
think of
that's the
it in
base.
in the miles and stuff. I used to think of it in terms of the miles, and now I feel like I'm more focused on like, okay, just get to know these species that are
Yeah.
here and then figure out how to work with them.
Yeah, it's a different mindset, right?
Yeah.
I was really pleased that in the book where you talk a lot about yields, because like I've seen so much over the last 6 months, probably just on the internet of just people talking about yields, and that's what farmers talk about. It's what the government supports: how to grow as much food as possible, even if it's the same goddamn nine things. And like I saw a pretty well-known journalist the other day talking about like feedlots, and it was just like killing me because he was saying that the feedlots can produce a lot of beef in a small amount of area, very with rather than the grass-fed beef that could actually be destroying the land of because if we're cutting down grazing land, blah blah blah, whatever. But yeah, so when people talk about yields, they're talking about a lot of the times in the U.S. they're talking about corn. It's it's twice as productive as the most productive chestnut trees per acre, something like that. I think I read in the book. And but there's all these costs that go unaccounted for, which you talk about. And monocultures require 60 times more input than polyculture planting. 99% of the corn isn't even consumed in the US. It's for like ethanol or for to feeding animals, and also it's heavily subsidized. And you met a guy who was planting chestnuts and pawpaws together, and the yields were actually approaching something like the most productive corn, industrial corn. And I found that fascinating that these are things with there's been no support over
Yeah.
figuring out yields of a natural ecosystem for so many years. It's all just been in, how can we industrialize food so much, get as much per acre as possible without all the additional costs that we're not taking into effect, all the pollution, the land degradation, the soil degradation, all these things. And yeah, but you found a guy that was, doing this with chestnuts and pawpaws, and also raising his sheep under the trees, and they were foraging for the nuts. And plus, it's not even taking into account all of the other animals, coming to feed on the nuts. If I don't know if he was hunting or not, but depending on how someone lived, that could be a factor. And it's just we really need to rethink how we think about these natural systems in a way, and how can we develop these systems in a way that isn't like destroying everything, but doesn't have all these unaccounted for cost. All this bad shit that we don't talk about. The guy talking about the feedlots the other day, he didn't once mention that those feedlots were using corn to or whatever grains to feed these cows, and that takes so much land.
Yeah.
It's so short-sighted.
Well, yeah, and it's also
And inefficient in many
it's
ways.
bad math. It's really not
Yeah.
actual math. One of the most impactful people I spoke to when I was really trying to get to the bottom of this yield thing, because it just kept bugging me. I was like, it does something about this doesn't make sense. There's a problem with this yield math. And I couldn't really figure it out for a while. I kept thinking about this class I'd taken in college where I learned about externalities for the first time. It was like senior year, I was taking Econ 101 to fulfill some requirement, and the professor started telling us about externalities, and I was like, oh, these are just all the unaccounted for costs that aren't part of this magical equation. Um, and I ended up interviewing in the process of thinking about this with yield, this agronomist named Ricardo Salvador, and he's really smart guy, really interesting. And he reminded me that yield is a ratio. So yield is measuring what you get out for what you put in. And if we can look at that in different ways. We can look at that in terms of money, but we can also look at it in terms of land. And when we say that these, super productive cornfields are high yielding and they're outproducing, all these other kinds of crops and especially polycultures, we're not counting the land that goes into overproducing on that little plot of land. So, someone who's producing, there's some guy who broke the world record. I can't remember now. It's like 32,000 I, pounds, tons. I actually can't remember the figure right now, but this insane amount of corn per
Okay.
acre. And like, we're not counting the land that grew the seed to do that corn. We're not counting the land that it took to create the machinery to produce that corn, the land that it took to produce the fossil fuels to grow that corn, the land that it takes to absorb the pollution from that. Like, we are not doing an accurate land cost analysis, and when you do that, when you start measuring, you know, all the land used to produce all the food that comes off of a given piece of land, the high yield of those monocultures completely disappears. And if we're actually thinking about feeding the world with land as a limiting factor, which it very much is, how much land do we need to feed everyone in the world?
Hmm.
That's about the least efficient way that we could possibly produce food. It doesn't make any sense when you factor in all the land. And I think that part of that, when we have the yield conversation, we tend to confuse ecology with economics. It might make a lot of economic sense to do things that way. I think that's fairly well
Hmm.
established. But the economic system is just an imaginary game of rules that we made up. It has nothing to do with ecological law or with the ecology of yield. And yield is very much ecological. It's not economical at its basis. It's like how much photosynthesis can this land do? How many calories can it produce? And when we start
Hmm.
looking at that, the polycultures they're always more productive. This fully functioning sort of I tend to think of it as like 3D versus like a flat piece of paper, right? Like if you have this land with trees and animals moving under the trees and other species, like all this diversity mixed in, you're always going to get more photosynthesis, more energy production, more food. It doesn't, they've done studies. One of the farmers I spoke with found me these really cool studies of oak savanna versus cornfield, which happen to be like the two ecosystems that I was very interested in. And when you look at the photosynthesis capacity, it's incredibly high in an oak savanna and much lower in a cornfield. So, that's sort of phase number one of why we don't need to produce food this way is it's not efficient in terms of actual land use. But the other part, like you said, is we're actually not eating all this food that we say that we have to produce to feed the world, which is a big red flag. If we're saying like we have to do this to feed everyone and then we're only eating 1% of that food, well, obviously we don't have to do this to feed everyone. That can't possibly be true if we're not eating it. So I think that there's been a very, very carefully crafted narrative around yield that doesn't line up with any of the facts. And when you look at that, these trees are super productive and are a very efficient way to produce a lot of food.
But I also say it depends on how you describe economics, right? Because yeah, you can divide these two ways of looking at production and when it's successful or not, right? And consumption. But it depends on how you understand for economy and economics and what are the values supporting that way of defining economy. So, because economy is related with wealth and the wealth of a region, nation, macro region in terms of production and consumption, right, of goods and services. If you define that well in ecological terms, then it doesn't make sense economically either. So,
I agree. Yeah.
it's like, and in other many ways, it doesn't make sense. So, I think the story and the narrative affects that definition too. You know,
Yeah, very much so.
narratives.
Elspeth, have you seen, are people starting to eat acorns where you live or any other tree nuts? Have you seen any kind of movement
Yeah,
beginning?
I see a really strong movement beginning in the Midwest. Where I am on Cape Cod, we don't have a lot of farmland, and I think as a result, we have just less interest in farm culture and agroforestry and these sort of
Hmm.
shifts in general. But I was just at the a joint conference of the Northern Nut Growers Association and the Chestnut Growers of America. So there's all
Hmm.
these nonprofits springing up in the Midwest around trying to transition back to some of these native crops that are part of those ecosystems historically. Oak savanna once covered a huge area of the Midwest thanks to indigenous burning and tending. And so this nonprofit in particular called the Savannah Institute is working with a lot of farmers in the Midwest to transition from soy and corn to hazelnuts and chestnuts. Some people are doing it as a polyculture, some people are doing it as more of a monoculture, but there is a broad conversation happening in these farm communities and a lot of momentum and excitement building around these perennial tree crops. So that's been really fun to see.
Yeah.
Cool, cool. No, that's amazing. I grew up in Ohio, and I've told this story here before. I grew up in the suburbs of Columbus, and just I was not exposed to anything like a farm. To me was just the things on the side of the highway that just grew, industrial corn. It was just miles and miles of the same, like they looked exactly the same every stalk, and you never ate it, you never had any touch with it. There was a human behind it. So to see people thinking in places like that, and I know they are in Ohio and other parts of the Midwest as well, just disrupting that way of thinking, just for kids to look and see what's growing and what the land can do is I think extremely positive.
Yeah, and I think part of what's happened is there were these sort of early adopters like 30 years ago, and a lot of those farms are now like
Hmm.
the farm that you mentioned, which is Red Fern Farm, where they have the chestnuts and the pawpaws and all these other edible fruits and nuts with sheep underneath. They've gotten to this size of
Hmm.
maturity where people can visit and they can see it, and it's something tangible. Like when I visited there, you drive through cornfield after cornfield after cornfield, and then you get to this little oasis of Red Fern
Hmm.
Farm with all the trees and the sheep, and it's one of the only places where you look around and you think, oh, there's something to eat here, because there's different things in season at different times. It's not just this one crop. And I talked to one grower who had been watching them for 30 years, and he finally said, okay, what
Hmm.
they're doing is working, it makes sense. And there's enough support now from groups like the nonprofits I've mentioned, and even some of the government conservation agencies for like soil health support, that they felt like we've seen enough that we feel comfortable transitioning. And so I think that we're at this point where there really are model farms that growers can look to and decide, yeah, I think it makes sense, which I don't think that we had 30 years ago. I don't think there were enough examples for it to become
Hmm.
a little more mainstream. Um, and like you said, there weren't kids seeing it. Like now I think it's becoming a little more tangible in some of these areas where people have really got them going and they're mature.
So have you been begun eating acorns? Like, is it like a staple of your diet now?
I wouldn't say I've gotten all the way to staple, but I've definitely started gathering and processing and eating acorns. I have more to learn before I get all the way to staple crop, but it's been a lot of fun. One of the first things I learned is like an acorn is not just an acorn. I'd be talking to people in Greece and California and the Midwest.
What is the processing like? Oh, there she is.
I am so sorry. I
Yeah, it's all
don't
right. Don't worry. Don't worry.
I don't know what's happening.
It happens.
Something always
So
happens with this. Yeah, it's all
frustrating.
right. Yeah, it's cool. So we were talking. Oh, what is the processing like? I asked.
Yeah, it's involves so acorns have tannins, just like olives. So I don't know if
Hmm.
anyone listening has ever picked an olive off a tree and tried to put it in their mouth, but you would be in for an extremely unpleasant experience.
Yeah.
I did it once. You spit it out, it tastes awful. And acorns share that same chemical, those tannins, which on the one hand are great because they're a preservative, but on the other hand, when you actually want to eat them, you really want to get them out.
Mm.
So any kind of acorn eating involves leaching, which is basically running cold water or warm water, depending on the product you're trying to make, through acorns until those tannins come out. The tannins are water soluble. Um,
Hmm.
so what I usually do is gather acorns in the fall, dry them out. I kind of like put them in a basket or on a baking sheet near my wood stove or in a dry, sunny spot. Just let them dry for a little while because they're a lot easier to shell once they've dried. The nut meat doesn't stick to the outside of the shell once they're dry. And
Okay.
then there's this nutcracker. If you start talking to acorn people, most people have a Dave built, which is this sort of hand crank nutcracker that you can run the
Mm-hmm.
acorns through. So you shell them, and then it depends what you want to make. Some people make oil, which you actually
Mm-hmm.
it that's just the fat, so it doesn't have those bitter tannins in, so you can just press them into oil. Some species are better for oil than others because not all acorns are the same. That's one confusing thing about acorns is like
Mm-hmm.
you can be talking to someone in Greece or California and you're talking about acorns, which you think is the same thing, and then it turns out no, they have really oily ones, you have really starchy
Right.
ones. Um, but mostly around here, what I collect, I've been using to make flour. The best like home method that I've found is to basically take the nut meats once you've taken off the shells, to put them in a Vitamix with cold water. And I don't want to do a Vitamix ad, but I've tried other blenders and they don't work for acorns.
Doesn't work.
So specifically for acorns, I do recommend the Vitamix. It makes it in this incredibly fine pulverized flour, which you could also do by hand with a mortar and pestle. It would take a while.
Yeah.
And then I spent some time at this place called the Maine Local Living School, and their method is what I like the best. They basically run lukewarm water through that acorn flour very slowly. They put it on a trickle, and they line like a colander with cheesecloth and put the acorn meal in there and just let that warm water trickle through it for a few hours. And with the species that we have here that I'm using a lot, which is white oak and northern red oak, so Quercus alba and Quercus rubra, or rubris, I might get that wrong. That seems to work pretty well. And the reason you can also do this with hot water, and hot water is a lot faster. But the reason a lot of people use cold water and that you want to use cold water is because it keeps a really important starch intact. So acorn has a starch that works just like cornstarch. It's a thickener. And for a lot of uses of acorn flour, you really want that starch. So you can use hot water and it happens much faster. Like you can boil the tannins out of acorns and that'll be quick, but it will also be not as good of a product when you're done. Um, and obviously that's a home scale and we're talking about feeding a lot of people. So there are people experimenting with larger scale processing. There's some chestnut growers in the Midwest who have realized that their equipment can also process acorns. So they're doing a lot of experimentation with using the same lines of equipment for chestnuts and acorns and producing flour that way, which I think has a lot of promise.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, that's great. Nick, do you want me to?
Sure. One thing I wanted to get into a little bit. I don't know if Elspeth can hear me. If not, Juliana can fill her
Yeah.
in. But there was a lot in the book about the relationship between fire and oak trees. Could she talk about that a little bit?
I'll tell you
Okay.
in a second. Between what? Sorry, Nick.
About fire and oak trees.
Oh yeah, that connection you make in the book about fires and oak trees.
You want me to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so as I learned about oaks and started learning like what an important keystone species they are, I went out to California and hung out with the man I mentioned earlier, Ron Reed, who's an indigenous medicine man and cultural biologist. And he started telling me that to maintain the oak ecosystems in their area, they use fire. So prescribed fire, cultural fire. And I was pretty interested by that. But when we first started talking about it, I thought it really only applied to that area. I knew that California had all this history with wildfire, and that, kind of made sense to me. But someone else said, you should really look into the history of fire and oaks in other areas. There's this whole hypothesis called the oak fire hypothesis, which I had never heard of. And it turns out that most oaks, not all oaks, but many oak species are what's called fire adapted. And they have this really long list of traits, thick bark, ability to resprout quickly after a fire. And so when I started looking into it, I realized that actually all over North America, oak trees and fire have had this really long relationship, and actually a relationship that has traditionally involved humans and human burning. Um, in Eastern North America, white oak has been the dominant species for 9,000 years, despite some pretty dramatic changes in climate at various points. And a lot of ecologists think that that is because of human burning and because people have been burning to keep these oak trees dominant on the landscape, because oaks are what's called a mid-successional species. So they don't like to get shaded out in terms of regeneration. If they start getting shaded out by birches and maples, oak seedlings won't do very well. They like a bit of an openness in the forest. And
Mhm.
so human burning for the past 9,000 years until pretty recently has actually maintained these conditions that oaks like and helped oak and hickory forests, especially in our area, regenerate. And that was a revelation for me because I've always seen oak trees as natural and wild, right? And those words, by definition, mean that there's no humans involved. There's no human tending, there's no human care. And the more I learned and the more I started thinking about it, the more I started feeling like these categories that we put on food production systems, like hunting and gathering versus farming, are really just, another layer of story, and that people tending oak trees are doing all the same jobs that a farmer is doing, controlling the water cycle, looking at pests and pathogens, but they're using this tool that can be really nuanced of fire to create the conditions that this food crop needs. So that was really a revelation for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super fascinating. And she noticed, like, she joined a fire, like a fire brigade, I guess, in where she lives. That, but the oaks weren't growing. Can she talk about that?
So there is a long-standing study of fire on oak ecosystems where I live, which I didn't know about before I started researching the book. I ended up going on some of the prescribed burns over there and getting trained in prescribed fire, and really starting to appreciate the amount of nuance that it takes to use fire effectively. So they were studying, what happens to the oak forest here if you burn every year, every 4 years at these different frequencies. And if you burn every year, you pretty quickly lose your oak forest because you're not having any regeneration of these oak seedlings. They need a few years without fire to get established. Um, and it depends on your ecosystem, but in different places you'll have these different fire return intervals, basically how frequently you want to put fire on the land in order to get the ecosystem that you're trying to maintain with fire. So I do now go on a lot of burns with Mass Fish and Wildlife, which is doing a lot of work in our area to restore oak savanna habitat and some other oak and grassland ecosystems. And the more I've learned about that, the more I've started to see this human wild relationship differently, because a lot of the ecosystems that we talk about as wild, uh, we can only talk about that way if you basically erase thousands of years of indigenous history. Um, a
Mhm.
lot of the landscapes that we see as natural and wild and that we talk about as natural and wild actually have a long history of human maintenance and human tending, and often with fire. Uh, and I would recommend anyone who has even the smallest interest in fire to get involved, because it's great people and it's fascinating. It's just fascinating to be out there figuring out in real time, like, well, what happens if we burn here? What happens if we burn here? And then going back and looking, I went back to some of the places we burned and there's all these oak sprouts, and it's like, okay, wow, you read about it in a book, but then you go do it and you see it, and
Yeah.
it's pretty cool.
Huh. That's
What I'm
wonderful. Yeah.
continually fascinated by is just this, like, long-term view of management, of like forest management, like especially when she got into more into the fires in the book, and how, like, indigenous management, fires were not necessarily every year, they might be decades apart. And just thinking about, food systems in this way, that it takes, in a way that's decades, this long-term idea of it is just like, it's counterintuitive to everything we've been taught about, like farming and agriculture.
I started researching because, first I thought the fire thing was maybe only California. And then I was like, oh, wow, it's out here where I live too. There's this long history of fire. And as I started talking with people in a variety of places, the British Isles, there's actually a really long history of humans using fire to tend a lot of these heathlands and other landscapes.
Mm.
Australia has this long history of food production with fire. The Amazon has a long history of food production with fire.
Yeah.
And I started really understanding what Ron Reed was telling me about our relationship with oak trees and this fire. He kept telling me that oak trees are our kin and that fire is medicine. And I thought like, oh, that's just a nice way to describe these relationships.
Mm.
But the more deeply I started to understand them, the more I realized like, no, this is literal. Like, we have been
Mm.
in this physical relationship with these trees for thousands of years. When he says that we're kin, uh, we're in a relationship. We're relatives in this way, not in the way of like, oh, we're in the same genus or whatever, but like we're in a
Mm.
relationship. We've been in a relationship for thousands of years. And I sort of, eventually managed to translate it into my own Western science speak background as like, okay, we're a keystone species too. We have a role to play in these ecosystems. And if we're important to oaks, which are, in their own right, incredibly important to all these other species, maybe the natural world wouldn't be better off without us, which I think is always an assumption that I had based on what I learned as a kid about our relationship with the ecosystems around us. We were always destroying things. I saw the post apocalyptic movies and you read the books, and like the ecosystems are thriving because the
Yeah.
humans finally disappeared. But like, well, is that true if our disappearance means these oak trees are struggling to regenerate? Because, in a lot of ecosystems where fire suppression has become more common in the past 150 years, oaks are really struggling to regenerate. They're seeing problems with oak regeneration across the northern hemisphere. And in a lot of places, it's tied to the loss of human fire. So, what I hope I do, at least a little bit in the book, is challenge people to rethink that idea that the earth would be better off without us. And because that kind of leads to like, well, we might as well just give up. Like, it'll be better when we're gone.
Yeah.
And if that's not true, then how do we want to rethink our relationships? How do we want to interact with the living world around us? I think it challenges people to think a little bit differently about how we're showing
That,
up.
yeah, that we can actually be helpful and necessary for the whole
Yeah.
system too.
Yeah. And I think it can be a little bit of a self fulfilling prophecy, too, right? If you believe, oh, we're just bad, the best thing we can do is remove ourselves, then
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
not going to interact. If you think, oh, we have a really important job to do here, because that was the other thing Ron kept telling me, we're not doing our job. We're not doing our job. And at first I was like, what's our job,
Yeah. For sure. Yeah.
But we do. We have jobs. And if we don't do them, then ecosystems suffer. And it's nice to be needed, It's nice to have a role to play besides like, oh, go disappear, because that's not it's
Yeah.
not a
It's
very
motivating.
exciting role.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh.
Yeah, no, it
Very
was.
cool.
I found it very hopeful. I think just the book throughout, just what these trees can do for us and what we can do for them, and I want to thank you for sharing your story with us.
So much for having me. It's
Thank
been
you.
it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Likewise.